panel is on contested M&A and the role of private equity. I'm Heath Winter with Longacre Square, and I'm joined by Ira Gorski and Francisco
Morales.
Thank you very much, Morales. We are also going to be moderated by Josh Kosman of the New York Post. Josh will be back in a moment. In terms of topics you can expect to hear about, we're going to be discussing the role of tariffs in activism and volatility that it creates. We want to discuss industries that are more likely to see contests going forward, potentially the role of the change in leadership at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, the impact that it might have on M&A activism. And then we're going to have a discussion on activist methods, new techniques that have been introduced, what's been working and what hasn't been working. So by way of background, like I said, I'm Heath Winter. I'm with Longacre Square Partners. We're a strategic advisory firm. We work with boards of directors, executives, and shareholders. My role at Longacre is primarily related to shareholder engagement. Prior to joining Longacre, I was at ISS on the Special Situations Research Team for about 5 years, and prior to that, I was on the buy side, working at various event-driven investment firms. Ira, who are you?
I'm Ira Gorski. I work at Edelman Smithfield, which is the financial communications boutique at Edelman, which is the largest independent communications firm. I spent most of my career up until I joined Edelman as an ARB, so also working on an event-driven desk, betting on hard catalysts, primarily mergers. And for today, one of the biggest impacts that I'm seeing in M&A is I believe that the change in antitrust perception is still causing a huge overhang. One of the bigger things that occurred under the Biden administration was a deviation from what's referred to as the consumer harm standard, where basically prior to the Biden administration, there was really, you could look at it as a continuum of Republicans and Democrats. They were on basically the same line, and there was a level of enforcement. And then under the previous administration, there was a complete departure from it, an abandonment of the consumer harm standard. They rewrote the merger guidelines, which included other things that weren't normally included, like labor and supply chains. And what was interesting to the market, to me, which was a departure, was the Trump administration reasserted those and kept those guidelines, which increased the instability of it. So I'll let you start on any other topics.
On that point, Francisco Morales, I'm a partner at Vincent & Elkins. I'm a M&A partner that does both public company and private equity representation, and recently I'm now the co-lead of our shareholder engagement group.
Ira, you raised an interesting point. From the perspective of contested M&A and regulatory enforcement, I mean, do you see an impact? Does that create a rationale for activists to oppose transactions because there's greater uncertainty about what kind of treatment you'll get under Hart-Scott-Rodino?
Well, the opposite,
Okay.
in the sense that the absolute best trade for an activist is pushing a company into a sale. Mm-hmm. And the M&A activity is down dramatically year over year. And you could say that's because of the M&A environment. You could say that because of the interest environment. You also have the uncertainty about the tariffs, and then you also have the overlay of the antitrust environment. So there's a lot more instability for activists to push on a deal to say you should be doing something else, because the probability of them being able to acquire or be acquired by someone else is lower, in my view.
When I think about contested M&A, I generally think about a shareholder that gets involved after the deal's already been announced and is either saying the price is too low, there's a better bid out there, you didn't run a comprehensive process, or is saying that they were better off standalone. The deal undervalues the company relative to the standalone prospects. And in either case, those are, and I'm speaking primarily from my experience at ISS, very difficult cases to make, because the reduction in risk to shareholders from getting out of that operating exposure is just so valuable, and it's so easy for a board to say, look, we ran a process, we responded to all inbounds that came in, This is the best value that's out there. It's at a, whatever the number is, premium to where we were on the unaffected date. It's really difficult to, without a hard catalyst like you were referencing, a shareholder who themselves is willing to step in as a buyer of last resort. It's really difficult to make a compelling case that it's better for a company to remain standalone.
Agreed from the target perspective, but from the acquirer perspective, especially if there's a share issuance, if they're going to have more than 20% of their shares issued, there's going to be a vote on the acquirer side. And then typically, because you're paying a premium for a target, and if you're issuing shares, your stock is going to get hit, one from just the premium, potentially dilution, and then it's also going to get hit because, ARBs, like I used to be, would be shorting the stock to lock in the spread. And then it's an easy thing to say that it's a bad deal when you announce it. A couple of years ago, there was a very controversial deal. IAA was bought by RBA. And so when RBA announced the transaction, it was off 16%. And then it opened the window for activists to come in and potentially rail against the deal, try to get it voted down. Because if you, from an ARB perspective, it's a similar trade. You're betting for a block. So if it gets voted down, then the acquirer goes back up and the target goes down, and you make the widening of the spread.
So you're thinking of the play of the activists today in the M&A landscape is going activists against the buyer in the stock issuance?
Yeah, if the stock, although it didn't happen in the Omnicom transaction, I think that was more of a structural issue in that they both needed each other. They'd kind of missed the boat with the repositioning and the shift in advertising. But I think that's the biggest vulnerability because you also have ARBs, which are generally panicky, and they take over the stock on both sides. And it doesn't take that much, even if the deal eventually gets done, and we've seen lots of those being pushed forward, it still creates a widening of the spread where you can make money, from point A to point B, not even conclusion.
That IAA RBA transaction is an interesting example because I remember, again, was at ISS, worked on the recommendation for that, and I remember thinking that the strategic rationale for improving IAA didn't necessarily tie to being managed by RBA, but the deal itself has worked out really well for shareholders. It's created a ton of value. I know that there was an activist the activists were involved on multiple sides of that transaction. One other note there that was kind of interesting was the role that Starboard played coming in as a white knight investing late in the process and kind of giving, to use Tad's word earlier, the imprimatur associated with Starboard blessing a strategy going forward. Josh, welcome to the table.
Sorry, I was caught off guard by the short last panel, which was very interesting, by the way. And Ira, thank you for jumping in. My name's Josh Kosman. I'm a business reporter for the New York Post, been covering M&A for decades. And I like the way it was starting. I guess a question that and everyone's been introduced, I assume? Yeah, okay. It seems like in recent contested M&A, some of the bigger situations, like Paramount that's very in the news, Endeavor that didn't get quite the coverage it should have, but was awfully interesting, that the activists ended up in a situation where they're Endeavor, they're 90+% are declaring appraisal rights. If you were a shareholder in Paramount, it's up for sale, but the stock's down, you're going to lose money, and you're preparing for the shareholder lawsuit that's about to come, and perhaps a bribery lawsuit that's about to come. So how do from different angles, you all cover this. How are things changing from an activist point of view? Are they looking more at, hey, this would be a great appraisal situation, as opposed to let me force the company to sell and then the stock goes up and I win? Like, it seems like the landscape is changing a bit, or is that these just like the major ones that are in the news?
I guess from the purely legal, an appraisal claim in Delaware it's not a great result, right? Like, Delaware courts are very differential, particularly once you have run a good process. So it was like a long go shop, and they're gonna say like, look, the process was there. This is fair market value. Like, there's no better indicator of value than all of that happened beforehand. Like, so I don't think it would be the strongest play as an activist to try to hang my hand on an appraisal.
That's a shift also, right? I can't recall the exact details, but appraisals, because you got a guaranteed interest rate,
Yeah.
like there's a recent change
Yeah.
in the attractiveness as an option, I think.
Well, so for appraisal rights, it's 500 basis points over Fed funds, and you get it from the vote, from when the transaction should have closed, and so that rate, it's basically 9.5%, which is as a spread is a huge amount of interest to accrue from the time that you would have gotten paid to then. Also, the Endeavor transaction is also very interesting because typically they cash out the differential, and they chose not to put more pressure on the people seeking appraisal rights. Now, appraisal rights were really hot for a while, and then ARBs got their faces ripped off with a bad judge decision where it actually went lower. So here it's a lot of risk, and it's risk from both sides. But regardless of the outcome of the appraisal rights, the deal is closed. So it's a payment risk. Paramount is a lot different in my mind, and Paramount creates a different type of issue. So I went to the American Bar Association Antitrust Spring Forum, and one of the big outshoots from that, and this is a function of the two Democratic FTC commissioners getting fired, Bedoya and Slaughter, and so it opens up a lot of the political element. And one of the things that was a takeaway from that is that the Trump administration could extract concessions that are completely unrelated to the antitrust matter at hand. And then the Paramount, to your point, is they have this outstanding settlement, this settlement negotiations for the Trump suit regarding 60 Minutes, which will be viewed directly as quid pro quo. And now you have this other antitrust environment. So going back to chilling, contested M&A or M&A in general, is that you run into this new variable of exogenous factors getting thrown in there to get a deal done.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a situation. So maybe staying for activists, how are they looking at the new DOJ and FTC in general? Stepping back from Paramount specifically, but we have an FTC where two Democrats were just fired. We have a DOJ that, by law they're supposed to be influenced by the White House. That's part of the White House. You could make that argument. And the FCC certainly seems to be under their thumb. So how did that change how an activist would look at things? Maybe Heath started with you.
Well, well, my crystal ball's on the fritz, but one thought that comes to mind, when you consider the activist campaign we saw recently at U.S. Steel, one of the points they raised was that the board of U.S. Steel agreed to sell to Nippon Steel and turned down for $55 a share and turned down an offer from Cleveland Cliffs for $54. And the reason, the basis, the logic that was presented by the board for turning down the Cleveland Cliffs offer was antitrust. And so the question becomes, if they had to look at it in the present regulatory environment, would they be more or less concerned? Side note to that is that the termination fee that was offered from Nippon Steel was on the order of $600 million, and the one from Cleveland Cliffs was $1.6 billion. And so you had $1 billion differential. And you got to figure you had regulatory risk either way. With Nippon Steel, it was a national security concern. With Cleveland Cliffs, it was an antitrust risk. And so the board, and Cora was arguing in the U.S. Steel contest, chose one risk over another in a way that probably would have worked out differently under the present regulatory environment, because they would have been much less concerned about antitrust risk with Cleveland Cliffs as an acquirer. From an activist's perspective, I have to imagine they wouldn't want to take the bet on regulatory obstruction serving as a basis for an investment. But it kind of feels to me like it's a little bit of apples and oranges.
On the antitrust front,
Go ahead.
the antitrust
Yeah,
front, what I find interesting is also going to be, even with this new administration, very industry specific.
That's true.
We've been looking at what they're doing with tech, right? And it's doesn't feel very different than what the prior administration was doing. I think energy, you're going to see larger mergers, I would assume, that the prior administration would have allowed. And the U.S. Steel, I do think that you would have probably seen that go through much more than like a foreign buyer. So it's going to be a little bit more of a nuanced analysis. I don't think it's going to be like, oh yeah, M&A, go ahead, it doesn't matter anymore, like whether you're a big player or not.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think there's certainly a continuation against the big tech. And then there was also, just from an antitrust standpoint, you had Commissioner Meter, and then you also had Ferguson come out with something very similar about the concentration of economic power is just as dangerous as the concentration of political power. But your point on the industry is energy is a global market. Refinery is something different. But I also think for infrastructure assets, they would get more of a pass because it's in line with the administration policies. So if you think about the firing of the two FTC commissioners, they were fired because they weren't in agreement with administrative policies. And so that just for people who haven't followed the antitrust that closely, the FTC commissioners have sued the administration because they have a very long-standing precedent. I think it goes back to, Humphreys, that there was a direct firing that that a precedent was set for an FTC commissioner. If the Trump administration does prevail in this case, it's going to be a completely overturn the FTC standing as an independent agency. The DOJ is clearly part of the executive branch. The FTC is supposed to be independent. It'll change things completely. So the Trump administration and then subsequent administrations will have a freer hand and be able to depart from other concentration measures.
Yeah.
One other element that I would just close in as a final thought is that from the perspective that you've got a lighter regulatory touch on certain industries now than you did under the previous administration, there's a limited window, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the next election. I'm thinking of a transaction, NXPI was the target, I can't recall who the buyer was, where they waited too long to file for European regulatory approval. They cleared the US antitrust approval, but ultimately the transaction didn't close because the timing was off and they didn't get the deal through while the window was open.
Yeah.
I believe that was Broadcom.
Right.
I was just going to mention in Trump's first term, interestingly and surprising to a lot of people, as you guys know, the FTC and DOJ stopped quite a bit. He was not a passive regulator. If you were to say it was him, it was not. It was. That's a matter of opinion.
And then the other thing we haven't. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
The other thing we haven't discussed is all of these transactions are truly global in nature.
Right.
So whatever the U.S. is doing is not going to affect at all how the European Commission reviews it, or like UK reviews it, or Invest Canada, or wherever. Right. Like there's so many other regulatory agencies that continue to be much more aggressive against like large.
I would argue that Trump's first administration was a preview to the politicized enforcement of antitrust. So AT&T Time Warner, was something that they fought tooth and nail. They lost. It turned out to be a horrible merger anyway. It was eventually sold to Warner Brothers, and it was a terrible merger for them as well with the decline in linear television. But it was a vertical merger at the time. There wasn't that overlap. So I could argue that that's first show of politics in there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I'm just thinking that in the first term was a Qualcomm deal he stopped, and that was like his friend or someone who contributed a lot to him.
Right.
So Trump's unpredictability, as everyone here knows, is not new, and it's hard to guess from an antitrust perspective or to analyze it.
There is also an element of reciprocity, right? So Sunoco recently inked an agreement to acquire Parkland in Canada, and there are substantial questions about whether Invest Canada, like you said, will obstruct that transaction just based on how tense relations are between the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, what opportunity do you think the tariffs give activists? They have to be looking at this issue as well.
Yeah, I think activists. You were mentioning the overall just a quantity of campaigns that have happened this year, right? And the campaigns that have happened this year, from the activist perspective, have been more on the operational side that it has been historically, and the M&A campaigns have been less than historically. And I think part of the reason why this is arising is in part because of the tariffs. They just have created winners and losers in the system, and the activists can attack the loser. It has further complicated supply chain issues that were coming along, so the activists can hone into the operational mismanagement of the company and attack through that way. I think you're continuing to see more of like an operational targeted campaign, or a campaign against the CEOs who are going to be shown as like not having been able to navigate these times.
So do you, Francisco, maybe do you expect more activist campaigns using tariffs as an opening salvo?
I think it's the effect of the tariffs more than the tariffs themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. So my answer is largely based on hope, because I want a lot of M&A to return. So where I think the tariffs come into play is that it's a dislocation of value. So when it's an opaque situation, it's unprecedented, people can't predict it. So when there's a dislocation in value and you create a lot of space or room for an acquirer to acquire the target, and then they've got flexibility in their valuation to adjust for all the risks that we just talked about, then activists could come into play and push companies into sale. So if there's a bid-ask problem between an acquirer and a target, the target could come under activist pressure to sell. And then that could hopefully, spurs more activity. The other thing about tariffs, just from a contractual standpoint, in the most recent transaction, Global Payments, FIS, when the World Pay transaction, the tariffs made it into the MAC clause. So they were explicitly carved out, which I think could be something going forward.
Well, actually, I would say it's customary to have tariffs carved out. But now everyone was looking at it, and you find it carved out.
It was there previously.
Yeah, but it's very customary for it to be in the MAE MAC.
Yeah, so just being an ARB for a very long time, it was always very interesting. Of whatever you just got clipped on made it into the next one. Yeah. So it was if it was hurricanes, caused a disruption. Hurricanes, act of God, made it into the next one. So tariffs, if they were in there previously, I could have skipped over it because it wasn't an issue. So
yeah. For those who don't speak the lingo, an MAE clause basically says like, if there's an MAE, we don't need to close the deal. But then those MAE clauses usually have like several items of like, but anything that is in this type of circumstances will not constitute an MAE. So everyone added COVID.
Right, COVID, yeah. So pandemics
and the like.
Prior to 2007, I had no idea what specific performance was, but following that, every contract I ever read, specific performance is the clause that where the seller can try to take the buyer to court to force them to complete the transaction if the deal's ready to close. And I had not been too concerned with it prior to 2007, but afterwards, like I said, every time. One point I wanted to raise about tariffs being a trigger for bringing in an activist. I don't have a view on whether we'll see more campaigns using tariffs as an argument, but as somebody who advises many of those shareholders, I would say that I would probably caution them against using that. We see a ton of deference from the proxy advisors and the large passive investors that are given to the incumbent boards. It's very easy for those boards to come to them and say, look, this is an industry-wide headwind. Everybody is facing this. Sure, it may be weighing on my stock more than it does on anybody else, but you can't hold me responsible for the quality of my oversight of the management when we're having to deal with this kind of a headwind.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's been a very effective defense.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jared, do we have time for questions, or should we grab one? Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's all right. Don't worry. Does anyone have a question?
All right, one step closer to happy hour.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Great job.